Hey there, YouTube. I'm Yukitsu. This is the Yukitsu Times. Welcome to my channel. Welcome to another Tuesday talk show, which is again late, but these things happen. In any event, what I want to talk about this week is a little bit more of Neon Genesis Evangelion, because I figured why not continue off with what we were talking about last week. In particular, I wanted to contextualize this and talk about it in reference to a particular subject. And I want to talk a little bit about things that are sort of like dark in media, because that's something that's a bit of a bit of a buzzwordy thing that gets thrown around from time to time. And you get other buzzwords that are sort of equivalent. You get things like more adults, more mature, more gritty, more bleak, whatever. Any of those sorts of words ultimately is used to refer to the same style of thing from most audiences. And what I want to do is talk about this in contrast with Bokurano. And the reason I picked Bokurano is because it deals with a lot of things that bother me about this general style of writing, without having to talk about sort of more controversial works that have a lot of the same structural problems and pacing problems that Bokurano does. Now, there are some people who liked the series because it was, in some ways, a darker version of Neon Genesis Evangelion, believe it or not. But there's a reason that Neon Genesis Evangelion is a series that is widely talked about, widely discussed, and whether you hate it or love it, you have an opinion about it. Whereas Bokurano is a thing that was it existed, it was in the public mind for a short period of time, and then largely disappeared. It has not withstood the test of time as being a very memorable or important series. And there's a multitude of reasons why it's not an important series and why it didn't revolutionize anime in any particular way. And it's an unfair comparison because Neon Genesis Evangelion was probably one of the most important ones in the industry in the 90s, but it's still a comparison that can be made. It didn't really do anything. And this is going to be the first comparison point here. I would say that there are sort of two reasons that people might incorporate very dark tonal elements into their works, whether it be about murder or about torture or about any of these sorts of elements that get thrown into things. And there's the first way, which is your story is dealing with things that by necessity pull those into it to deal with its themes, its content, and its ideas. And I think that Neon Genesis Evangelion, for a greater extent, deals with them in this particular way. It's trying to express certain ideas and get across certain conditions of the human condition. And in doing so, it has to draw upon these sort of darker elements of the human psyche and the elements of reality that get pulled into it to make us have that psyche. And it doesn't have to be dark all the time as a result of this. A lot of the series is actually quite lighthearted. It's simply the case that there are certain points in the story where it necessitates things like death and things like social isolation and anxiety and depression, because that's what they're trying to explore, and they have things that they want to say about that. This, I think, is the better way to deal with dark elements, where these are incorporated into the story because they're meant to explain the themes and ideas that you want to discuss. The other way that you can view it is the way that it was very endemic in the 90s, and this is including darkness and edginess or extreme whatever, as the end goal in and of itself, where you have a character who's going through some really dark, depressing things, or who does really bad things themselves. And they would do this because the work wanted to have those in it. They didn't have anything profound or interesting to say about the sort of process there. One of the most sort of imminent examples of this persisting to this day would be comparing Alan Moore's work to Zack Snyder's of the same sort of content. Alan Moore, I think, very much knew that he was trying to make a particular statement, and he wanted to incorporate certain themes and ideas into his work, and sort of an analysis of the human condition. And in doing so, incorporated a lot of really horrible things into his story. Whereas I think to a very large extent, Zack Snyder wants to incorporate those because he wants to make it a dark story. I don't think he really has anything profound or interesting to say. People talk about him having a vision, but that doesn't seem to really hold true because he doesn't have any thematic ties between everything that make any cogent sense, in particular in his works. And the same sort of goes for Bokurano. If you watch this series, it is much more miserable and much more bleak than Neon Genesis Evangelion ever is, because it's a relentless march of bad things happening to relatively decent people for relatively no good reason. And there's no sort of greater or deeper themes that the show is seemingly trying to explore that I could sort of dissect from it. You could obviously project something into it, but there's nothing obvious that jumps out like the psychology aspect and depression and social anxiety that is really, really obvious and blunt instrument in Neon Genesis Evangelion. It just doesn't have anything that's sort of like that. And you could always interpret something as having greater meaning than it really does. And even for a series like Eva, which does have a lot of meaning to it, people try to project even more into it that it doesn't really need. I think that no one really does with Bokurano, though, and this is one of the reasons why it hasn't really withstood the test of time, why no one talks about it really, and why it's not really a well-beloved series or well-hated series either. It's simply out there. And this brings me to the next point about it, is that it was hard for me to watch this series, not because the horrible things that were happening to the characters made me uncomfortable, it's that it is relentlessly boring. I think the same complaint can be leveled against Neon Genesis Evangelion for certain types of people, especially because the series itself is kind of dualistic in its nature, and one of the stories that you can interpret is very boring, whereas the other one is very intense and interesting. Bokurano can only really be interpreted in sort of the one way, but I suppose that there might be another way in which I'm missing. Neon Genesis Evangelion can be interpreted as being very plot-driven, where it's about getting into the mech and fighting the robots. And if you've got this interpretation of it, you're probably not going to enjoy the series. And on a very surface level, this is what the plot is about. But it's not a plot-focused series. It's really done. It doesn't really give a crap about the sort of plot or what's going on in terms of progression. What it cares about is the characters. It's a character it's a character study, it's a character analysis, it's trying to get deeper and deeper into the psyche of the individual characters. And in this sense, enjoying the series in that light makes it a much more interesting series with a much with a lot more to dissect in it. The plot itself has got a lot of applicability in that you can push religious allegory into it without it being too much of a stretch, really, but it does not really focus on that. You know, those are definitely set dressings and interesting parts to the series, and they've done them very well, but it's not the core soul of what the series is supposed to be about. Bokurano doesn't really have that sort of through line that's trying to make it so that everything's tied together by something that it wants to say. It doesn't want to explore anything. It doesn't want to deconstruct anything. Whereas Neon Genesis Evangelion at every turn very much does. So for those of you who don't know, and there are going to be spoilers for both of these series, Neon Genesis Evangelion focuses on our very, very wimpy sort of protagonist, who's meant to be sort of a counter-argument to all of the other child soldiers that you see in early mecha. And this isn't really as much of, but still is a bit of a trope for the mecha genre, where you'd get a very, very young pilot, somebody who's in his early teens, piloting these giant robots and going off and fighting in a war and saving everybody from whatever the hell. And this is a pretty common sort of storyline in Japanese anime from like the 80s and even earlier than that. What Ava wanted to do was just be like, hold on, none of this really makes sense. Why would, these kids' parents be okay with this guy piloting this deadly weapon that could be used to destroy whatever the hell? Why is this character okay with being a child soldier and risking his life and limb every day? Why is he okay with watching his friends getting blown to pieces? How is that not affecting him psychologically? It would ask questions like, why is this sort of character archetypes acting the way they are? In particular, Asuka and Rei are exactly those questions. What causes a person to act in the way that a tsundere sort of character does is what they were trying to say for Asuka. And in particular, their conclusion is that to act like that, you'd have to be a really messed up person, and that largely is true. Same with Rei. What kind of person would you have to be to act like that? And the answer is you'd have to be a severely broken sort of person. What sort of coping mechanisms do people use to deal with trauma is what they ask with the characters like Masato. What sort of abusive parents let their children ride around in these giant robots? What sort of society allows that? By asking sort of all these different questions, it's tempting to sort of break apart the genre. Bokurano isn't really doing that, because anytime you ask one of these questions, it just says, well, because they have to. Why do the parents allow the children to pilot these gigantic robots? Well, they don't really let them. They just get sucked into it whenever anything appears and they have to fight. There's no option otherwise. What sort of society would allow this? Well, society doesn't really allow it. They're trying to fight back against this happening whenever they get a chance to, but they're ineffectual because the plot has to follow this very self-contained set of rules where it's just these people have to do it. They don't really address the fact that these are essentially child soldiers because none of them seem to be overly affected by it. The character development for each of these characters occurs before their focus episode, at which point it develops their backstory, but not their sort of reaction to the current situation that they find themselves in, or how they're sort of relating to that, or what sort of a realistic reaction to the situation would be for that sort of character. So a lot of what occurs in Bokurano isn't a reflection of any sort of genre convention, or a breaking down of those genre conventions. It's simply saying that we're using those genre conventions, and the justification is going to be that, well, they have to. There's no other way that they're allowed to go forward, which is really, really uninteresting. It's basically every sort of story where everything gets hand-waved away by it's because magic, because ultimately that's what does it. There's this little puppety thing that just tells them what to do and they have to do it, and end of story, no debate. And I really don't find that sort of storytelling all that engaging. The motivations for everybody are almost entirely external in that sort of sense there. Going back to Eva again, another difference between them, it does focus much more heavily on a smaller core of characters, and there's other characters sort of on the periphery that don't get focused on. This is because the characters sort of survive throughout the entire series, except for one of the Rey clones, who of course does die in one of the episodes. And this allows us to explore those characters and their interpersonal relationships with each other much, much more deeply. And there's nothing strictly speaking wrong with killing off your main character. It's become sort of almost a popular thing to do in recent years. And while it can be done well, I don't find that it often is done very well. In fact, when I refer to it being done well, I'm not even referring to Game of Thrones, which I think is what people think of immediately when they discuss this. And the reason is that it doesn't allow you to understand characters very well, except on a very surface level. Some of the characters who do incidentally survive, of course, you can understand much better, but Bokurano is very relentless in the fact that it kills off all of its characters. The way that it's sort of formatted is a gigantic robot appears that the main characters have to fight, and one of them gets randomly selected to fight that particular battle. And that particular pilot gets some backstory development, and we understand them as a person a little bit better, and they sort of tell us a bit about their motivations. But we get basically like one episode's worth of development for that character, which is usually just an endless parade of sort of really crappy things happening to them, or them having these really negative reactions to something, or just everything is very bleak and dark and miserable for no good reason. And I say no good reason because, if you're plotting a story like this, having different elements in tone helps make it so that the negative aspects actually matter. So, as a non-surprise for this, after each battle, whoever was piloting it at the time dies, and this is sort of an inevitable thing, and the entire cast of the show sort of gets picked off one by one as they encounter each new sort of monster of the week. And this means that the amount of development that we get is relatively limited, and they end up being fairly one-note characters each. And there's no surprise to the fact that they die. There's no sort of suspense about that. There's nothing really interesting about the death itself. And so we can assume that they're not trying to go for shock value past the first past the first death. The first one we could consider to be sort of a shocking thing, a surprising thing. But everyone after that we know is going to die, and we know how it's going to happen. So the shock value is completely gone for the rest of the 22 episodes after the first death. I can't remember off the top of my head right now. But in any event, we're no longer going to be surprised by it. So the way that this could be impactful is if they made it emotional. And there are ways to make a death emotional in a series where it has only introduced that character for 2 or 3 episodes. And a good example of this would be something like Voices of a Distant Star, which is able to intimately make us care about the two characters in that story in a very, very short OVA. And I would actually recommend that people go watch that one because it's a really, really good one. But Ava does this as well, and they've sort of done it in a very, very different way. The reason that Voices of a Distant Star is able to pull you into the characters and make you care about them is because it's very well directed, and it's able to compress a lot of emotions and a lot of information in very, very short amounts of dialogue and very short amounts of representation. And Bokurano isn't as well directed in any sort of sense there. While they definitely could have gone this route, it would have required a much, much, much more skilled writer, and I don't think that there are very many who could do that over the course of a 24 episode series. Like I said, Voices of a Distant Star is a very short OVA. It's a single story, self-contained, and is designed basically by a person who wanted to be able to sort of draw you in a very short period of time and have a lot of emotional impact. The other way is to have it be relevant to another character. Kaoru's death in Neon Genesis Evangelion doesn't make you empathize with Kaoru and feel bad because that, if you're watching that scene and you feel bad, it's because you feel bad for Shinji, I would argue. And this is because the entire series he has been struggling to create an emotional human connection with somebody in the story, and he always falters in some way or another, or fails to connect, or fails to have them understand him in the way that he wants to be understood. Kaoru is the first individual in the story who's capable of actually empathizing with Shinji in the way that he wants to be empathized with. And so his entire goal is to meet someone like Kaoru, and then he has to kill him. And so the emotional impact for this part, you don't really understand Kaoru very well. You don't know him very well. He's been in the story for like an episode, basically. But at this point in time, you feel for Shinji because this has been sort of it's a very cathartic moment in a very strong sense there. And it's also very well directed. It lends a lot of weight to itself. So I think that to a very large extent, Bokurano is sort of mired by its own format, where it's killing off these characters one by one by one by one, and never letting you really understand them or get to know them any better before killing them off. And again, I don't think that this is necessarily a bad thing, but it's not really a plot-driven show. The plot of it is very boring. The plot is a robot shows up, and then the main cast beats it. And you sort of know that that's going to be how it happens up until the very, very last one, where you think maybe they lose this one. But you get the distinct feeling that there's definitely going to be one character doing each of the battles sort of situation there, which is sort of how it pans out, although there's a few exceptions to that. And you just really don't feel anything for those characters. You don't feel any sort of relief when they succeed, because you know that's going to kill them, and you don't really care that they're going to die because you've not learned to love these characters in any sort of way, or empathize with them, or really care about them. And I know that like you'd think that you'd have some empathy for someone dying, but you know that it's fictional because the story is very very, very fictional feeling. So even though these are very much, in both cases, non-real characters, very fictional characters, there's a certain way in which a character like Shinji or Asuka feels as though they could be a real person, even though they're more exaggerated personalities than the characters in Bokurano. They sort of grow on you in that kind of capacity there. And I think even the people who really hate Neon Genesis Evangelion kind of do have that happen to them to a very certain extent there. A lot of them who complain about the series, not all of them, but a very wide portion of it, are just really rooting for Shinji to do something and just are very frustrated that he's not doing it. And I can understand that point of view, but I'm not looking at any of the characters in Bokurano and hoping that they do something different than what they do, because I don't really care what happens to them, because I know they're just going to get killed by the arbitrary rules of the system that they live in. I don't feel there's another choice that they could have made. I don't feel that their struggle is an internal one. And I definitely don't feel as though it's a plot-driven sort of story. I do think that they tried to make it a character-driven story, where it's supposed to be about each of these characters, a very short yet depressing sort of vignette about a character in a sort of bleak sense there, and then we move on to the next one. And it's that sort of way that in which they treat them as kind of disposable, that I think also makes it so that it's hard to empathize with them or care about them on any sort of human level. So this is, I think, one of the last things I want to talk about here. Neon Genesis Evangelion is kind of a silly series in a lot of points, where the main character is not actually that miserable. I would actually recommend people go back and rewatch the show and figure out how many times Shinji actually runs away from a battle. Because his sort of reputation is that he's a coward that runs away from everything. But, sort of compare and contrast that for how many times he runs away or does not run away from a battle and acts in an extremely aggressive and self-destructive way that, is the exact opposite of what you would expect from a coward. He actually does run into dangerous situations quite a lot throughout the series, and usually when he's running away, it's running away not from necessarily danger. It's running away from other traumas that are associated with that. Like, there's one point in time where he wants to not pilot the Eva because he's literally been forced to kill, depending on the version that you're watching, Toji, his best friend, or Asuka, the person that, he's got a fairly close relationship with it by that point in time. They hate each other, but I would argue that Shinji and Asuka are actually the two characters that are most similar to one another and are most able to empathize with each other, but also because they both hate themselves, they both also hate each other. So that sort of element is definitely there. But yeah, he's been forced to kill one of those two or brutally injure them, or he thinks that he's killed them, depending, again, on the version. In, I believe, the manga, he actually kills Toji. I think in the show, Toji is heavily injured and forced to move, and you never see him again. Although he may actually be dead, since they could just be telling him that to make him feel better. And in the rebuild, in 3.3... you cannot advance. I can't remember actually right off the top of my head. It's revealed that Asuka, who is piloting it, is still alive afterwards, but she has an eye patch. So I don't know. In any event, though, this sort of leads us to that situation where all these characters are having like these different moments where they're either happy, or they're connecting with each other, or they're sort of doing things that feel very much like a real person would actually do in their sort of time. And this means that you actually care about them a lot more when things go south. You care about people who you've had, a good experience with. You care about them if you've had bad experiences with them. But when you've had nothing but relentlessly bleak, horrible things happen to a character, you don't really care about them all that much. If everything that you've ever experienced with somebody, think back to somebody that in your life that, every single time you've experienced something with them has been abjectly miserable and terrible and awful, and you're probably going to think that that person's not a lot of fun to be around or that interesting. You just don't really care about them all that much. And similarly, think about that sort of person that maybe you had nothing but good times with. Like, yeah, that's great, but you're probably going to feel a lot closer to the person who you've had some really great times with and you've had some really bad times with. I think that that's going to be the person that you most empathize with because you've seen them at both their highest and their lowest. There's a sort of mark of tragedy about Neon Genesis Evangelion that isn't in Bokurano, since there's a definite element of characters being built up to highs and then being crushed back down. Kaoru actually, in that story arc, was a good example of that, where Shinji finally achieves that bit of self-connection, and because he is built to finally achieve that goal of getting the connection that he wants, it's all the worse when he has to kill it. There's all those scenes where he feels like, he's finally conquered something, but he, despite that, doesn't get the recognition that he wants. Despite the sort of glorious victories that he can win in battle, he doesn't get the thing that he wants out of it. He needs something else out of these. Bokurano doesn't really have these humanizing highs to its story arc. It just has, every time things could potentially have had some sort of positive spin on them, the characters are absolutely assured to get kicked while they're down before they can get back up. And this really just leaves them as being kind of pitiable, but also ultimately not that interesting. So anyway, that's my take on those sorts of topics. Hope you found this one enjoyable. I know it's a bit of a bleak one to be talking about, but on the silver lining of it, just remember that if you're watching something that is really bleak and tragic and terrible, if it's done well, it'll probably have some good silver linings to it. So anyway, hope you found this episode enjoyable, and of course, as always, hope to see you guys all next time.